The hum of porch lights flickered above me when my daughter's husband leaned back in his chair and said, "She should be grateful we keep her close." Still, I nodded, calmly, like a woman too tired to correct someone who's never earned her silence. As the string lights buzzed louder, they blurred against the bottle of wine I had bought, and the house I had paid for. While my daughter looked away, pretending she hadn't heard, I folded my napkin like I was tucking something in for the last time. The same hum followed me inside as I packed my records, my receipts, and every cent they mistook for shared. That's when I left, with no fight, no note, and made sure the trust was locked before they noticed the air had changed. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The smell of grilled corn and mesquite hung thick over the backyard like a promise. Fireflies blinked lazily around the hedges, their glow no match for the string lights Mildred had wound around the porch banister earlier that afternoon. Plastic patio chairs scraped across the cement as cousins and uncles and second wives made small talk over half-drunk bottles of Pinot and IPAs in koozies. Mildred stood over the grill like a general, stainless steel tongs in one hand. A towel flung over her shoulder. Her white blouse was peppered with grease spots, her silver hair tied back in a fraying braid that still somehow looked dignified. Her eyes were on the chicken thighs, but her ears were tuned like a hawk's. Brian was already on his third glass of wine. He swirled it lazily, the ice clinking, even though Mildred had told him twice that wine shouldn't be iced. But Brian wasn't the kind of man who listened to corrections. Not from his mother-in-law, and certainly not from his wife. "She should be grateful we keep her close," he said suddenly, casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. Julia didn't laugh exactly. It was more of a soft, nervous chuckle, thin, like the stem of a wine glass just before it snaps. She tilted her head, glanced briefly toward Mildred, then looked away. Sadie, 12 years old and sharp as a tack, froze mid-bite. Her fork hovered in the air like a held breath. She turned slowly, deliberately, to face her grandmother. Mildred didn't look up from the grill. "That's kind of you," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone, no smile, no hint of sarcasm. Just a neutral phrase with enough space inside it to hide 1,000 thoughts. Brian didn't notice, or didn't care. He was already launching into a story about someone from his office getting passed over for a promotion and how meritocracy was dead. Julia nodded along, eyes glassy. Sadie didn't touch the rest of her potato salad. The rest of the evening passed like warm molasses. The kids roasted marshmallows. The adults argued over football. Someone brought out a Bluetooth speaker that only played 70s soft rock. Mildred cleared plates, refilled drinks, laughed when she was supposed to. She was good at this. The performance. Had been for years. But that night, something cracked. Back in her apartment, the silence was both a balm and a curse. Mildred turned on the lamp in the corner of her living room, the yellow light casting shadows on the old wooden floor. She slipped off her shoes, walked to the small desk wedged beside the bookshelf, and pulled open the top drawer. Inside was a file folder. Gray. Unmarked, except for a single word in black Sharpie. Options. She sat, slow and deliberate, and opened it. The papers inside were yellowing, some typed, some handwritten. Receipts, copies of emails, notes scribbled on napkins, a business card from a private investigator she hadn't called. Yet, at the very bottom was a photo. Old, slightly bent, but still sharp. Julia younger, sitting on the front steps of their old house, barefoot and smiling, holding a baby swaddled in a checkered blanket. Mildred's house, the one Brian insisted she sell, because a widow didn't need that much space. She ran her finger over the baby's face. Sadie. She thought of the moment at the dinner table, the way her granddaughter had looked at her, confused, betrayed, like someone watching a lighthouse flicker off just when they needed it most. She should be grateful we keep her close. That line played over and over in her head like a scratched record. Keep her close, like a pet, like a problem, like a burden. For years she'd told herself she was keeping the peace. That keeping quiet meant staying involved in Julia's life, in Sadie's. That silence was safety, but tonight, The lie tasted bitter in her throat. She picked up the phone, not to call Julia, not to call Brian. She dialed a number she hadn't used in 7 years. Her hand didn't shake. It rang once, twice. Then a woman's voice answered, sharp and alert. "Mildred?" Mildred's lips curled into a faint smile. "I hope you haven't retired," she said. A pause. Then a low chuckle on the other end. "You finally ready?" Mildred glanced again at the photo of Julia and Sadie. "No," she said. "I was ready years ago. I'm just finally done pretending I wasn't." She closed the folder. The next morning, Mildred would be gone. The leasing agent sounded young, maybe fresh out of college. Cheerful voice, peppy, not the type Mildred would normally trust with anything real. But the studio was available. Clean, quiet, second floor, month-to-month lease, no fuss. "It's yours if you want it. We can process everything digitally," the girl chirped through the phone. "I'll be there in an hour with a cashier's check," Mildred said, already pulling her wallet from the drawer. She hung up, stood for a moment, and let the weight of the decision settle on her bones. She had expected a tremor of guilt, a pinch of fear. Instead, what rose in her chest felt dangerously close to relief. By 10:45 a.m., the lease was signed. Keys in hand. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just a click of a lock that now belonged to her and no one else. Julia left for work at 7:20 a.m., like always. Blouse slightly wrinkled. Laptop bag over one shoulder. She offered a distracted smile on her way out, somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion, and didn't notice that the pile of Tupperware in the sink was already gone. By 7:45, Mildred was packing. She started with the photos first, the only ones she cared about. Sadie's kindergarten graduation, that blurry shot from the pumpkin patch, a black and white one of her and Walter, taken just months before the cancer sunk its teeth in. She slid them into a soft folder and wrapped it in a sweater. Next came the essentials, the good knives, her tea kettle, her box of saved letters. She left the dishes, the lamps, the framed print Julia had picked out at Target and insisted looked vintage. Mildred didn't want anything that had ever been chosen for her. She didn't bother with suitcases, just boxes, plain, cardboard, scuffed from their previous lives. The same ones she'd used when she'd packed up her house after the funeral. She filled them neatly with the kind of precision that came from years of being the one who always knew where everything was. By 9:30, the apartment was quiet again, except for the low rumble of Irene's old Buick idling in the alley behind the building. Mildred stepped outside carrying the last box. Irene stood leaning against the trunk, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding the full brunt of her expression, but not the flicker of concern underneath. "You sure about this?" she asked. Not for the first time. Mildred nodded. "I've been sure since last night." Irene opened the trunk. "Then let's go before your daughter comes home and tries to turn this into a group therapy session." Mildred managed the smallest smile. "That woman hasn't asked how I'm doing in 3 years. I think we'll be fine." They packed the last of it quickly, efficiently. 2 women who had seen their share of endings and knew how to close a chapter without slamming the cover. Before she left, Mildred stepped back inside one last time. The apartment looked bare without her things, echoey. Still, she didn't write a speech, didn't rehearse some touching goodbye. Just scrawled 5 words on a yellow sticky note and stuck it dead center on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for everything. I've moved out." She closed the door behind her without looking back. Sadie found the note first. The apartment was dim when she walked in, the late afternoon light filtering through the blinds in long stripes. She dropped her backpack by the door, kicked off her sneakers, and headed for the fridge before her eyes caught the small square of paper waiting like a message from a ghost. She read it once, then again. Her hand trembled as she pulled out her phone. "Are you okay?" she texted, thumbs flying. The reply came faster than she expected. "Yes, sweetheart. I finally am." Sadie stared at the screen, her pulse hammering. Something felt different in those words, like her grandmother had just stood up in a room full of people and said something no one else had the courage to say. She read it again. Then she hit call. The line rang once, twice, but this time, Mildred didn't answer. Mildred powered off her phone just after sunrise. No ceremony, just a firm press of her thumb and a long exhale as the screen faded to black. The world could wait. Julia could wait. Sadie. She'd understand eventually. Mildred set the phone in the kitchen drawer next to the corkscrew and closed it with a decisive click. The cottage was small, square, and smelled faintly of dust and cedar, like an old hope finally getting sunlight. 2 windows faced east, where the light poured in like warm honey across the hardwood floor. She had spent the night on a twin bed she'd hauled in herself, the mattress still in plastic. A single lamp had kept her company, casting a golden pool onto a paperback she never opened. She stood now in the center of her kitchen, hands on her hips, surveying her little kingdom. Her tea kettle sat on the stove, just where she liked it. A new wooden spoon set gleamed in a mason jar. The scent of lemon cleaner clung to the cabinets she'd wiped down the night before. There was no noise, no footsteps overhead, no Brian flicking channels, no Julia sighing, just birdsong. By mid-morning, she had unpacked most of her kitchen and decided on muffins. Blueberry, her favorite, not Brian's, not Sadie's, not anyone's but her own. She stirred the batter slowly, methodically, humming under her breath. When the tray went into the oven, the warmth spread through the kitchen, coaxing open the scent of lemon and vanilla. At exactly 11 a.m., she carried a small basket of 6 warm muffins across the narrow gravel path to the cottage next door. An older woman with cropped white curls answered the door in garden gloves and floral clogs. "You must be the one who moved in," the woman said, with a bright, toothy grin. "Muffins? Oh, honey, you're dangerous." Mildred smiled, small and real. "Figured I should introduce myself." They spoke for 7 minutes on the porch, just long enough for the muffins to start steaming in the cool November air. Back at home, Irene was waiting in the driveway. She didn't bother knocking, just walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard tray. "Did you know your phone's off?" Mildred raised an eyebrow. "That's the idea." Irene smirked and handed her a cup. "He called me too. Brian, 4 times. He's panicking." Mildred took a sip. It was exactly how she liked it. "Let him." "He said he was concerned about your emotional stability," Irene said, air quoting it with both hands. "That man wouldn't recognize emotional stability if it served him breakfast." Mildred turned back toward the hallway. "Come with me. I've got a meeting." Clark Donahue had been her attorney for 15 years. Balding, soft-spoken, fond of antique cufflinks and sentences that began with "legally speaking." He met her in his small downtown office, eyebrows raised as she slid over a manila folder labeled "Revisions." "I'd like to update my will," she said calmly. "Remove my daughter as financial proxy, effective immediately." Clark blinked, his pen hovering over the paper. "You want to transfer full financial authority to—" "Sadie," Mildred replied. "She's only 12, so I understand there are limits, but the framework needs to be in place. Everything else, power of attorney, health directives, estate distribution, should bypass Julia completely." He adjusted his glasses. "You're certain? I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." She left his office 20 minutes later, paperwork notarized and sealed in an envelope that felt heavier than it should. She stopped at the post office next. Changed her address on everything: bank statements, Social Security, insurance, the IRS. She did it with the quiet precision of a woman finally unscrewing the bolts from a life that had held her hostage in plain sight. By late afternoon, the cottage had transformed. The floors glowed. The kitchen smelled like lemon oil and muffins. A soft flannel throw was folded neatly on the couch. Her rocking chair, the one Brian said looked too grandma, sat by the front window, waiting for twilight. She boiled water for tea and sat down at the tiny desk she'd positioned perfectly beside the window. Outside, kids biked past on cracked sidewalks. Wind rustled through the dying leaves. Everything felt real again, undemanding. But just as she brought the mug to her lips, a knock echoed from the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 precise taps. She stood, every nerve waking up at once. Another knock. She opened the door slowly. On the front step stood Sadie, alone. Mildred stepped aside, and Sadie walked in without a word. Her backpack was slung low on one shoulder, hair frizzed from the wind. She looked older somehow, like the silence between them had aged her. She didn't ask to sit, just dropped into the armchair by the window, legs curled up like she used to when she was 5 and had a cold. You're really gone, Sadie said quietly. Mildred nodded. I am. Sadie didn't cry. She just stared at the floor, at the rug with the frayed edge. They're freaking out. Mom's texting everyone. Brian's calling Irene like it's some emergency. Mildred poured a second cup of tea and set it gently on the side table next to Sadie. There's no emergency, sweetheart. I'm exactly where I need to be. Sadie nodded, blinking fast. I know. A car door slammed outside. Mildred stiffened. Sadie glanced toward the window. Mom. A beat later, a hard knock. Not the tentative, uncertain kind Sadie had used. This one was sharp, assertive, announcing itself like a warrant. Mildred opened the door. Julia stood on the step, coat open, face flushed, breath visible in the cold air. Her hair was pinned up too tightly, and her lipstick had cracked at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes scanned the space behind Mildred, as if expecting to find some hidden accusation waiting on the walls. I didn't get a response, Julia said flatly. Mildred didn't step aside. I turned my phone off. I noticed. A pause. Then Mildred moved just enough to let her pass. Julia stepped inside and stood awkwardly near the kitchen, arms crossed, like she didn't know what to do with them. She spotted Sadie, exhaled hard through her nose, but said nothing. I'm not here to fight, she offered. I don't understand why you didn't say anything. You just left. No warning. I said plenty, Mildred said. You just didn't listen. Julia's jaw tightened. Brian didn't mean what he said. You know how he gets. He drinks too much. He says stupid things. He meant it, Mildred interrupted, calm and unshakable. He meant every word. And you didn't stop him. That's not fair, Julia shot back, voice rising. You act like I don't care about you, like we haven't done everything we could to make you feel at home. Mildred turned, slowly. You mean like letting me cook every night? Letting me watch your daughter while you and Brian stayed late at work? Letting me sell my house to make your life easier? That's not what I raised you, Mildred said, the words landing like bricks. Alone. I buried your father. I gave you a home when Brian lost his job, and you had nowhere to go. I have done more for this family than you'll ever admit, because you don't want to admit it. Because that would mean acknowledging that the person you treat like an obligation is the reason you've made it this far. Julia's mouth opened, but no words came. Sadie shifted in the chair, but didn't look up. You think I left out of spite? Mildred asked, quieter now. I left to save whatever dignity I had left. Because you and that husband of yours looked at me like a charity case every time I opened my mouth. And I let it happen, until now. Julia's voice cracked when she finally spoke. We've done a lot for you, Mom. Mildred didn't blink. And I've done more than you even realize. Silence ballooned in the room. Sadie traced the rim of her mug with one finger. The kettle clicked off behind them. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Julia looked at her mother like she didn't recognize her anymore. I just wanted a conversation, she said softly. Not this. Mildred nodded slowly. You don't get to choose the tone now. That was the trade. You spent years speaking for me, speaking over me. Now you get the silence. She turned away. Julia stood for a long second, unmoving. Then she walked to the door and opened it. The wind blew in, sharp, cold, impatient. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind her like the lid on a long-buried box. Mildred didn't move. Sadie stared at the door, then at her grandmother. Finally, she whispered, She's not coming back, is she? Mildred took a sip of tea, eyes on the window. She already left, she said. She just finally realized it. The cottage smelled like cinnamon and cedar by the time Mildred sat down with her checkbook. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves against the screen door, a faint rustling that sounded like whispers from a life she'd finally closed behind her. The dining table was covered in papers, statements, receipts, old envelopes, each one marked in her crisp handwriting. She worked in silence, tallying every check she'd written, every temporary loan that had quietly turned permanent. She paused at one receipt. A roofing contractor, $4,300, paid in full after Brian had insisted the insurance would cover it. It hadn't. Another folder held Sadie's college fund ledger. She'd been depositing small amounts every month for years. A little from her pension, a little from Walter's insurance payout. The total now stood at nearly $24,000. By the time she finished counting, the grand total hit $68,317. 7 years of invisible giving. 7 years of filling in the gaps, smoothing over their mistakes, being the invisible cushion beneath their pride. Mildred leaned back, pen still in hand, and let the numbers sit in front of her like a quiet verdict. Not anger, not anymore, just clarity. Clark Donahue had expected her call. His office smelled like paper and lemon polish, same as always. He'd swapped the brass desk lamp for a sleeker one, but otherwise nothing had changed, not even the stack of half-signed documents he kept near the corner, pending review. When Mildred entered, he gestured to the chair without a word. She laid down a single page. The spreadsheet was tidy, typed, dated, totaled. He adjusted his glasses. "Is this the financial record you mentioned?" "It is," she said. Clark's brows rose slightly as he scanned the numbers. "That's quite a sum. Do you want me to record these as forgiven or forgotten?" Mildred didn't hesitate. "They forgot my humanity. Let's call it even." Clark's lips quirked into something between admiration and disbelief. "You're serious? As a heart attack?" He nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. "And you'd like all remaining funds, savings, annuities, investments, redirected to the trust we discussed. For Sadie," she confirmed, "held until she's 30. She'll need time to make her own mistakes before anyone else tries to spend her inheritance for her." Clark smiled faintly. "I take it you don't intend to tell Julia." Mildred's tone was mild, almost amused. "Julia stopped listening a long time ago. There's no point speaking into a void." He made the change quietly, the steady scratch of his pen the only sound between them. Mildred watched the ink dry, feeling a strange peace settle over her. This, she realized, was the sound of reclamation, one careful signature at a time. When Clark slid the final document toward her, she signed without hesitation. For once, her name looked powerful on paper. Irene showed up that evening with a bottle of bourbon wrapped in newspaper. She set it on the counter like an offering, then dug out 2 mismatched glasses from Mildred's cabinet. "I heard from Clark," she said. "He called to make sure you weren't having a stroke when you said to liquidate everything into the trust." Mildred chuckled. "He always worries too much. I think he's just never met anyone who gets freer by the day." They sat on the porch, bundled in sweaters, the night air sharp with the scent of burning wood from somewhere down the street. Irene poured 2 fingers for each of them, then lifted her glass. "To your second act," she said. Mildred raised hers in reply. "To finally being the author." They clinked glasses. The sound was small but satisfying. For a long while, neither spoke. The sky bled from gray to indigo, and the cicadas hummed their steady chorus. The bourbon burned clean going down, cutting through the chill that had lingered since Julia's visit. Mildred set her glass on the railing, watching the condensation form little halos around the base. "I keep thinking about what he said," she murmured after a while. "That I should be grateful they kept me close. Maybe he was right. They did keep me close, close enough to use, close enough to drain." "And now?" Irene asked softly. Mildred's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Now they'll have to learn what distance costs." The porch light flickered once, a weak bulb on its way out. Mildred didn't move to fix it. For the first time in years, she liked the dark. Sadie's knock was barely audible, 3 soft taps, like she was checking the weather, not visiting her grandmother. When Mildred opened the door, there was no greeting, no speech. Just Sadie stepping forward and wrapping her arms tight around her waist, burying her face in Mildred's sweater like she had when she was 5 and afraid of thunder. Mildred stood still for a second, startled by the contact, then wrapped her arms around the girl and held her close. "It's quieter at home," Sadie mumbled against her. Not in a good way. Mildred held on tighter, letting her cheek rest against Sadie's wind-chilled hair. "Quiet can be a comfort," she said, "but not when it's full of avoidance." Sadie pulled back slightly, eyes a little glassy but clear. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to them. Everything feels scrambled." "You don't have to say anything," Mildred said gently, "and you don't have to take sides. But I won't pretend anymore. That's over." Sadie gave a small, tired nod. "Good. I'm tired of pretending too." Inside, the cottage was warm, lit by golden afternoon light and scented with cinnamon and baked apples. On the counter sat a cooling tray of scones. The fireplace cracked faintly in the background. A single candle flickered in a short mason jar, giving off hints of cardamom and orange peel. "I saved 2, Mildred said, already moving to the kitchen. "Still warm if you're fast." Sadie peeled off her coat, letting it fall across the back of the armchair, and followed. She took the offered scone without ceremony, broke it in half, and sighed. "Oh my God," she muttered with her mouth full. These could cause an emotional breakdown. Mildred smiled, poured 2 mugs of coffee, black for herself, splash of milk and a sugar cube for Sadie, and brought them to the table. A worn, spiral-bound cookbook lay open between them, pages yellowed and dotted with flour fingerprints. The margins were filled with handwritten notes and memories. "Too dry, try more butter, or add cinnamon, skip the nutmeg. Walter always hated it." Sadie flipped to a dog-eared page and laughed. "Use brown sugar and less regret," she read aloud, pointing to the margin beside the peach cobbler recipe. "Did you write this?" Mildred sipped her coffee. "Regret ruins the flavor. Learned that one the hard way." They talked for a while, about school, about her math teacher who always smelled like peanut butter, about how the cat was now exclusively Brian's shadow because Julia had started snapping at it. Then Sadie looked up, serious again. "He's acting like you robbed him." Mildred's face didn't change. She set her mug down slowly and folded her hands around it. "He mistook access for entitlement." Sadie tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It means people like Brian think kindness is a door that stays open no matter how often they slam it," Mildred said. "He thought he had rights to parts of me I was only lending." Sadie chewed her bottom lip, processing. "He asked Mom if you'd lost your mind. Said no one just gives up like that unless they're mentally slipping." "I didn't give up," Mildred said. "I opted out. Big difference." They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, steam rising from their mugs. Outside, the wind nudged leaves along the porch like they were running from something. Sadie shifted in her chair. "She's trying to act normal, but she's not. She snaps over everything now. Yesterday she yelled at the coffee maker for dripping too slow." Mildred chuckled under her breath. "Guilt's got sharp edges when it's not acknowledged." Sadie stood and wandered toward the bookshelf, running her fingers across a row of spines. One journal caught her attention, a small leather-bound notebook with gold-etched corners. "Can I have this?" she asked. Mildred nodded. "Of course. Fill it with things no one gets to edit." Sadie turned it over in her hands like a secret. Mildred stood, crossed the kitchen, and pulled a second journal from a drawer, one with a matching cover. "I've kept mine since before you were born," she said. "It's not all wisdom. But it's honest." Sadie smiled. "That's more valuable anyway." She tucked both journals into her backpack, then grabbed another scone, wrapping it carefully in a napkin. At the door, she paused. "Mom's gonna ask if you talked about money. What should I say?" Mildred leaned against the frame, the wind catching the edge of her sweater like a slow wave. "Tell her I finally made an investment. With return guaranteed." Sadie's eyebrows lifted in appreciation. "Cryptic. I like it." Mildred watched her walk to the sidewalk, backpack bouncing, scone in hand, journal against her side like a compass. She didn't call out, didn't wave, just watched. Sadie turned once before rounding the corner. "She'll come back to you," Irene's voice said quietly behind her. Mildred didn't turn around. "She already has." The phone rang just after dusk. Mildred almost didn't answer. It had been a long day of small comforts. Fresh linens, a pot of soup cooling on the stove, the kind of quiet that hummed instead of echoed. She'd just settled into her chair by the window, the one that caught the softest light. The phone's vibration on the counter broke that stillness, like a fly buzzing in a sealed room. For a long beat, she just watched it pulse. Julia. Of course it was. She let it ring once more before she picked up. "Mildred," Julia said immediately, the word brittle, stretched thin between apology and accusation. "Hello, Julia." A pause. That heavy kind of silence that's really just someone winding up. "You left without warning." Mildred exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "I left after years of warnings. You just didn't hear them." Julia's laugh came sharp and nervous. "You always do this. Turn everything into some poetic little metaphor instead of just saying you're angry. I'm not angry. Then what are you? Mildred turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, dusk was sinking fast, blue melting into black, the first stars smudging into existence. I'm free, she said simply. Julia scoffed. That's dramatic. No, Julia, it's overdue. There was shuffling on the other end, a sigh, the sound of pacing. Brian says you're rewriting your will. Is that true? Mildred didn't move. You've both had enough from me. That's not fair. I'm aware. Julia's tone cracked, desperation creeping in through the edges. This family is falling apart, Mom. Mildred's voice stayed calm. Then stop pretending it was together. That landed like a door closing. For a long stretch, neither spoke. Mildred could hear her daughter's breathing, fast, uneven, and imagined her standing in that oversized kitchen, one hand pressed to her temple, trying to summon control like a trick that used to work. You've always been so dramatic, Julia said finally, her voice smaller now. You don't have to punish us to make a point. I'm not punishing anyone, Mildred said. I'm just refusing to be collateral damage anymore. Julia huffed, exasperated. Brian was right. You're acting irrationally. You're isolating yourself, cutting everyone off. It's not healthy, Mom. Mildred smiled faintly, though her voice stayed steady. If you call peace isolation, then you've forgotten what quiet feels like. Another long pause. Then Julia said softer. Do you even care what this is doing to Sadie? The question hit harder than Julia meant it to, but not in the way she hoped. Mildred's eyes softened. Sadie understands more than you think. She's 12, Julia snapped. She shouldn't have to understand this kind of drama. She's 12, Mildred echoed, and already knows the difference between love and control. Maybe that's what's bothering you. On the other end, Julia's breath caught. You've turned her against us. No, Mildred said gently. You did that all on your own. The silence that followed was long enough for the kettle to click off on its own. Mildred got up, poured hot water over a tea bag, and carried it back to her chair. The cup steamed between her palms like a soft punctuation mark. Julia finally broke the quiet, her voice shaking. I don't understand how you can be so calm when everything's falling apart. Mildred took a sip. Because, Julia, she said softly, sometimes things have to fall apart so they can stop pretending they were holding. You're impossible, Julia whispered. Completely impossible. I've been a lot of things, Mildred said. But impossible? No, just finally uninterested in performing. Julia's tone shifted, brittle to pleading. Can we please talk in person? I'll drive up tomorrow. We can go to brunch, maybe. Julia, Mildred interrupted quietly. You don't come to a fire expecting to save the smoke. What the hell does that even mean? It means I love you, Mildred said. But I won't keep burning just to keep you warm. Julia's voice broke on the next word. Mom. Mildred could picture her, standing in that bright, cold kitchen, the weight of her own choices pressing down, the performance unraveling. Good night, Julia, Mildred said, her voice soft but immovable. And before Julia could say another word, she ended the call. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. She set the phone face down on the table and let the silence fill the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint rustle of pine. The kettle clicked again. The house exhaled. Then, from across the room, the phone lit up once more, not Julia this time. Sadie. 3 words on the screen glowed through the dim light. Can I come over? Mildred smiled. Always, she whispered. The sky was pale and indecisive as Mildred stepped into Clark Donahue's office. A thin folder tucked beneath her arm, and the quiet satisfaction of control, trailing behind her like perfume. His assistant barely looked up from her monitor. Mildred was a regular now. Clark stood as she entered. You're early. I'm done letting other people set the clock, she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. He offered a half smile and slid a slim black folder toward her. Everything's finalized. The trust is officially sealed, irrevocable, and on file with the clerk's office. Mildred opened the folder with reverence. The legal language was cold, clinical, but it was hers. Her name, her choice, her voice, finally carved into law. And Sadie, she asked. Clark nodded. Sole contingent heir, no joint control, no early access, no substitute proxies. Contesting it? Triggers a forfeiture clause, he said, almost admiring the ruthlessness of it. Any legal challenge, no matter how small, and the beneficiary loses everything. No appeals, no exceptions. Mildred traced the edge of the page with one finger. They always thought I'd go quietly. Clark adjusted his tie. They still think you're bluffing. She closed the folder gently, the way someone closes a book after reading the last line. Let them. That afternoon, she stood in the loading bay behind the local food bank, holding a check in one hand and a tin of oatmeal cookies in the other. This isn't necessary, the volunteer said, taking the cookies with a grateful smile, but it's lovely. Mildred handed her the envelope. I'm donating in my husband's name, Walter Grayson. He used to come here with extra produce from our garden before he got sick. I think he'd like knowing he still mattered. The volunteer's smile softened. We'll make sure he's remembered. Mildred nodded, then stepped back toward her car. It was brisk out, one of those fall days that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to rain or shine. She liked that uncertainty. It made the world feel honest. She sat in the driver's seat for a long minute, the engine idling, one hand still resting on the steering wheel. Then she pulled out a pen, opened the small notebook on her passenger seat, and crossed off a single line. Give Walter the last word. The next day, she sat at her desk with Irene reading aloud from a fresh stack of documents. Obituary preferences, Mildred said, flipping the page. No florals, no euphemisms, no long-winded saints and angels nonsense. Irene raised an eyebrow. You want it short and sharp. I want it accurate, Mildred said. Mention the garden, mention Walter. Mention the 3 decades I spent running a church breakfast pantry on a shoestring budget. But leave Brian out of it, completely. Irene looked up. Even as your son-in-law, he was never family. He was a permanent house guest who thought the lease came with legacy. Mildred's voice held no venom, just finality, the kind that didn't need to be defended. Irene smirked and sipped her tea. This is cleaner than my taxes. I've earned a clean ending. Mildred gathered the papers, clipped them neatly, and slid them into the filing box beside her desk. The box was labeled After, in bold black marker. It sat between the tea tins and a photo of Sadie feeding ducks at a pond. Her world now was quiet, sharp-edged, and beautifully, finally, hers. She stood and moved to the window. The maple out front was almost bare now, the last golden leaves trembling on the branches like they hadn't quite made peace with the fall. How long do you think it'll take Julia to find out? Irene asked, standing beside her. Mildred's expression didn't change. That depends on how long she can pretend nothing's changed. And Brian? Oh, Mildred said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. He'll figure it out the first time he tries to write a check on someone else's future. They both stood in silence, watching the wind do what time always does, strip things down to what's true. The kettle began to whistle faintly from the kitchen. Irene squeezed her arm. You're colder than Clark on audit day. I'm clearer, Mildred corrected. Clarity just happens to have a chill. Then the doorbell rang. Not tentative, not urgent, just deliberate. Mildred glanced toward the door, heart slowing, not speeding. She wasn't afraid anymore. She opened it. And there stood Brian, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable, voice too calm. Mildred, he said with a practiced smile, I think we need to talk. The door was still open. Brian never stepped inside. He stood on the threshold too long, offering vague lines about misunderstandings and family breakdowns that rang too polished, too rehearsed. Mildred had let him speak, watched his lips move like a man giving a eulogy for a relationship he himself had strangled. She didn't say much, just nodded, thanked him for the visit, and gently closed the door on whatever charade he'd been trying to sell. She didn't lock it. She just didn't open it again. That night, Mildred sat at her desk beneath the soft glow of her reading lamp. A storm was rolling in, distant thunder stitching itself across the horizon in slow rumbles. Her tea had gone cold, untouched beside a worn box of papers labeled Julia, Elementary. She hadn't looked inside in years. Now, with steady hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, time capsules in miniature, construction paper cards with glitter that still shed, drawings of castles and suns with long eyelashes, spelling tests with big red A's, and letters, so many letters. Dear Mommy, I miss you when I'm asleep. Thank you for packing my favorite sandwich. I love you bigger than the moon. You smell like cinnamon and safety. Mildred smiled as she read, then frowned. Each line made her ache in a different place. She unfolded one carefully, creased from years of being touched and retouched. Julia's second-grade handwriting danced across the page, crooked and fearless. When I grow up, I want to be kind like you. The sentence struck harder than any of Brian's barbed pleasantries ever could. She set the letter down and reached for her journal. In her precise hand, she wrote, "She didn't become cruel. She just stopped resisting it." Mildred closed the box and breathed in the faint scent of paper and old glue. Regret didn't visit often anymore, but tonight it sat politely beside her, asking nothing, just existing. The next morning, Mildred arrived early at the library's side door, a tin of banana bread in one hand and a canvas tote full of books in the other. She had started volunteering at the Children's Reading Circle a week ago. 1 hour, twice a week. Nothing formal, just stories on a rug and a dozen sets of eyes blinking up at her like she might be the one to explain how the world worked. She never did, but she read with warmth, with rhythm, with a voice that made dragons less scary and lost puppies worth finding. That morning, a boy named Carson asked if the mouse in the story would ever get a real name. Maybe, she said, if he stops letting everyone else name him first. Carson had nodded like she'd just handed him a secret. Later, she sat in the quiet part of the library, sipping lukewarm coffee and flipping through a gardening magazine she had no intention of subscribing to. That's when the text came. From Sadie. Image attachment. Drew this for you. Home isn't always a house. The drawing showed a tree with long, wild branches and a rocking chair under it. 2 birds rested on the chair's arms, one large, one small. At the bottom, in neat block letters, Grandma's house, her peace. Mildred swallowed hard and clicked the image to full screen. It wasn't art, it was understanding. That evening, Mildred dusted off the old record player, the one Brian had called outdated junk when they helped her move out of her house. She pulled one vinyl from the shelf, Joni Mitchell, Blue. It cracked to life slowly, the sound grainy at first before warming into something real. She sat by the window with a blanket around her legs and let the music fill every quiet space in the house, not to fix the silence, but to meet it. Her eyes wandered to her desk, where Sadie's drawing now sat framed in a simple oak frame. Next to it was a candle and a photo of Walter in the backyard, caught mid-laugh, his hands stained with tomato vines. She didn't feel lonely. She felt chosen, not by Julia, not by the family she had stitched together until it suffocated her, but by herself, by Sadie, by the life she'd rebuilt from splinters and crumbs. A sudden knock startled her from the music, not sharp, not tentative, but familiar. She rose slowly, crossed to the door, and opened it. Sadie stood there, wind-chapped and glowing. "Can I stay the night?" Mildred stepped aside. "Of course you can." And this time, the door didn't just close behind them. It stayed closed. The porch creaked, just once. Mildred was in the kitchen, rinsing mint leaves from her garden when she heard it. Not a knock, not footsteps, just the gentle complaint of old wood and stillness disrupted. She didn't rush. By the time she stepped out onto the porch with 2 mugs in hand, Julia was already there. She sat on the far end of the swing, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on nothing. No makeup, no jewelry, her hair up in a messy knot that said she hadn't planned on being seen. Mildred didn't speak, just placed one of the mugs on the table between them and took the seat across, folding her legs beneath her. Julia finally looked up. "I'm not here to fix it," she said, her voice quiet, unsteady. "I just needed to sit somewhere where things weren't so loud." Mildred nodded, taking a slow sip of tea. "Storm's still howling over there." Julia gave a humorless laugh. "Brian's trying to talk at me and around me at the same time. Every sentence is a strategy now." Silence settled again, but it didn't ache like before. It lingered, respectful, like the space between 2 dancers waiting for the next beat. They sat in it, just the clink of ceramic. the soft hiss of wind through the dry maple leaves above. Mildred glanced toward the yard, watching a squirrel dig furiously in the fading light. I don't suppose you still make that butternut squash risotto, Julia smiled faintly. Only on nights when I want to feel like I know what I'm doing. Use thyme or rosemary? Thyme, Julia said. Rosemary makes it taste like soap. Mildred's lips twitched. You finally agree with me. Julia took a sip of tea and breathed in deep, the steam curling around her cheeks. You always used to play music when you cooked. I never understood why until recently. It made everything feel less mechanical. It made things stay mine, Mildred said, even when everything else wasn't. The sky above them was starting to bruise, soft streaks of purple giving way to dusk. After a moment, Mildred added, You're welcome here, Julia. Always, but not your expectations. Julia didn't flinch. She didn't argue, just nodded once, slowly, like she was still hearing the sentence long after it had been spoken. I didn't tell Brian I was coming, she said after a long pause. He wouldn't have let me, or he would have made it about something else. That's his habit. Julia rubbed her hands together. I kept thinking about those nights when I was little, when Dad would be gone on those awful work trips. And I'd crawl into bed with you, and you'd just rub my back without saying anything. I remember, Mildred said softly. It was the only place I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. She looked up then, eyes glassy but honest. I think I stopped making space for you to do that. Mildred's voice was gentle, but firm. You stopped making space for me to exist outside your needs. Julia looked down at her tea. But you're here, Mildred added. That's something. Before either of them could say more, the screen door creaked behind them. Sadie padded out barefoot, her hair damp from a shower, holding a bowl of grapes and a sketchbook under one arm. She paused when she saw them both, like she'd stepped into the wrong timeline. Hi, she said carefully. Julia smiled, small, nervous. Hi, honey. Mildred reached behind her and pulled an old throw blanket from the porch bench. It's getting cold. Come sit. Sadie looked between them, then down at the sketchbook in her hand. And then, without hesitation, she slid onto the porch swing between them. Julia shifted to make room. Mildred wrapped the blanket around her granddaughter's legs. No one spoke for a moment. Just the rhythmic creak of the swing as it moved slightly with their weight. Sadie popped a grape into her mouth and flipped open her sketchbook. I'm drawing a memory, Julia leaned over gently. Which one? Sadie smiled without looking up. This one. The porch stayed quiet. No one reached for a camera. No one posted it. No captions. No proof. But it would live, etched in something far more permanent. A few feet away, inside the house, the old record player spun silently, needle resting in its cradle, waiting. The text came just before dawn. One long paragraph. No punctuation, no warmth. Just a scattered thread of guilt and noise. Julia's signature in digital form, rushed, overwrought, and orbiting the same question she never learned how to ask directly. I guess you're happy now, and that's fine, and maybe I never knew how to be what you needed. But I tried, Mom, I did, and maybe I don't say it right, but I do love you. You just don't make it easy. Mildred read it once, eyes calm, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she pressed delete. No response, no draft, just disappearance. Some things weren't cruel, they were necessary. That morning, Mildred stood in the lobby of the clinic where her chart still bore Julia's number beneath primary emergency contact. She handed the receptionist a folded sticky note with Sadie's name, number, and school listed clearly. Just in case, Mildred said. The woman nodded, made the change, and thanked her for keeping things updated. As she stepped back out into the brisk morning air, Mildred thought of how long she'd lived with contingencies designed to protect other people's peace of mind, not her own. That chapter was over. Her next stop was the credit union. The banker smiled when she asked to open a new checking account, and even more when she explained it was just for giving things away. I want to keep it separate, Mildred said, so I can see what kindness looks like when it's measured. She deposited an initial $1,500, then wrote Starter Fund on the memo line of the first check. The account name, Grace and Grit. It made her laugh. It made the teller smile. It made sense. Back home, she brewed a fresh pot of coffee and dialed Irene, who picked up mid-yawn. You're calling before 9 a.m. That's criminal. I just booked us something, Mildred said, grinning into the phone. Is it breakfast? Better, Irene perked up. Now you've got my attention. A weekend art retreat in the Catskills. Clay work, watercolor, and apparently something called intuitive journaling. Sounds like therapy in disguise. I thought you might say that. You're paying? I'm living. Irene let out a low whistle. Well, hell, pack your overalls, woman. Let's go get weird. Mildred smiled, clicking confirm on the retreat site. And just like that, another thing that used to belong to other people, her time, became hers again. Later that afternoon, she drove by her old neighborhood. Just once, slowly. She didn't park, didn't stop, just turned down the familiar street and let herself feel everything she didn't miss. The house was still there, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, a new wind chime hanging on the porch. Someone else's life had moved in. Good. She reached into the passenger seat and picked up the old set of keys, still on the leather fob Walter had given her the year Sadie was born. She gripped them once, then turned into a strip mall parking lot and walked straight into a donation center. The woman at the counter smiled. Clothing? Furniture? Keys, Mildred said. The woman looked confused. To a house I don't belong to anymore. The woman nodded, slowly but kindly, and reached for the little basket. Mildred dropped the keys in. They made no sound. That night, she sat at her desk, going through old letters and saved voicemails, sorting what stayed and what could go. She lit a candle, played Billie Holiday low through the speaker, and let the dust gather softly at the corners of her window. Before she closed her notebook for the night, she wrote one last check, made out to the Pine Hollow Animal Shelter, in honor of the beagle Sadie had begged for 2 years ago. The memo read, "For the ones still waiting to be chosen." She sealed it in an envelope, kissed the flap shut, and added a tiny sticker to the back, a silver star, left over from her days volunteering in Sadie's second-grade class. The weight of her own choices didn't press on her, it lifted her. Mildred stood, stretched, and reached for the small journal where she now kept daily gratitudes. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Today, I deleted a message and felt lighter. Today, I gave something away and felt fuller." She smiled, closing the cover. Then her phone lit up again. Not Julia, not Sadie, Brian. No message, just a missed call. And 5 minutes later, again and again. Until the screen said 6 missed calls. She placed the phone face down on the table. Then she turned up the volume on Billie and let it play her past out the door. The letter from Clark came in a heavy envelope, the kind that hummed with consequence before it was even opened. Mildred slid it open with a butter knife, careful and steady, as though slicing through something sacred. Inside, 2 pages, one typed, one handwritten. The typed one was official, stamped, notarized, signed twice in blue ink. The headline at the top read like a verdict: Evaluation of Cognitive Capacity, Findings, Unimpaired, Alert, Decisive. Below that, in clinical formality, the words that had been doubted, whispered, weaponized against women like her for generations. The subject demonstrates full comprehension, logical reasoning, and autonomous decision-making capacity. She read it twice, then she smiled, slow, deep, the kind that curled all the way down into her bones. Clark's handwritten note followed beneath it, neat and succinct. "Mildred, it's done. Evaluation attached for the record. Added to the trust file under capacity verification. Capacity unquestioned. Their lawyers can't touch a thing. Yours always. Clark." She folded both pages neatly and placed them inside the folder marked Options. The same one she'd first opened weeks ago, when this all began. But now, instead of grief and hesitation, the folder felt like a ledger balanced in her favor. The phone rang an hour later. It wasn't Julia. It wasn't Sadie either. Clark's voice came through, calm and dry. "They're making noise." "Brian?" He sighed. "And a lawyer I've never heard of who thinks bluster is strategy. They've threatened a competency review of the trust." Mildred poured herself a glass of water. "Then give them one." Clark chuckled low. "Already did. Sent the report to their counsel, along with a preemptive cease and desist. I don't think they'll enjoy the wording. What wording? I quoted your line, he said. She's not losing her mind, she's reclaiming it. Mildred couldn't help it, she laughed. A clear, rich sound that startled even her. You're cruel, Clark. I prefer thorough. Then you've outdone yourself. By evening, word had already trickled down. Sadie texted around 8:30. They're spiraling. Mildred typed back with deliberate care. Then let them. I'm done being their anchor. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. You sound like you, finally. Mildred smiled at that, because it was true. Every decision she'd made since walking out of that cramped apartment had carved her closer to herself. Each signature, each deleted message, each silence had become a mirror reflecting the woman she was before exhaustion dulled her edges. The next morning, she stood on her porch, the air brisk enough to bite. She held a small cardboard box in her hands, light, rattling softly when she shook it. Inside, the wind chimes Irene had given her after Walter's funeral. She had never hung them before. Too sentimental, Brian had once said when she'd mentioned it. Wind chimes are for people who want attention. She smiled now at the memory, not bitterly, but like someone finally remembering the punchline. The nails went in cleanly. The chimes were glass and copper, delicate but not fragile. They caught the first breeze and sang, low and resonant, like a voice rising from underwater. Mildred stepped back to listen. The sound filled the yard, bouncing off the siding, scattering into the trees. Each note was soft but insistent, a language only peace knew how to speak. Irene pulled up just then, her car crunching over the gravel drive. She climbed out, sunglasses perched on her head, a brown paper bag swinging from one wrist. You're up early, she said. That's suspicious. Couldn't sleep. Irene squinted up at the new edition. Ah, so you finally hung them. They've waited long enough. Everything good? Everything's right, Mildred corrected. Irene smiled. You know, it's funny. People underestimate the quiet ones until the quiet starts costing them. Mildred's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Then they call it cruelty, when it's really just consequence. The wind shifted. The chimes answered. Irene handed over the paper bag. Brought bagels. Thought you might need carbs for your next act of defiance. Mildred laughed, taking it. Defiance burns calories, apparently. They sat together on the porch steps, eating in silence. The kind that didn't ache, didn't stretch, just was. After a while, Irene nudged her. So, now that the lawyers have been silenced, what's next? Mildred tore off another piece of bagel, thoughtful. Something they can't contest. Like what? Mildred glanced up at the wind chimes swaying overhead, their soft glow catching the sunlight. Legacy, she said simply. The kind that doesn't fit in a file. She rose, brushing crumbs from her lap. The morning light hit her square in the face. Warm, insistent, unyielding. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Not a text, a call. Sadie. Mildred answered, her voice lighter than it had been in years. Morning, sweetheart. On the other end, Sadie hesitated. Then, Grandma, you're not going to believe what Mom just did. Mildred's eyes flickered to the chimes. They kept ringing. She took a slow breath. Try me. It arrived in an envelope the color of old linen, her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in years, slanted, careful, and once familiar enough to make her chest tighten. No return address, just Mildred Grayson written across the front like a confession. She stood by the kitchen counter for a long time, letter opener in hand, uncertain if she wanted to know what waited inside. Then she slit the envelope cleanly, the sound crisp against the quiet morning. Inside, one sheet of paper. Julia's handwriting. Neat, unhurried, honest. Mom, I let him speak for us. I shouldn't have. I let his certainty become my silence, and your patience looked like stubbornness from where I stood. I know now it wasn't. You were just done performing. I don't know if there's a way back, but I wanted you to hear from me without him in the room. You were right about the noise. It's deafening here. Love, Julia. Mildred's hands trembled, but not from anger. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the letter soft in her lap, and for the first time in a long while, she let the tears come. Not sharp tears, not grief, Recognition. They fell quietly, the way rain falls when no one's watching. Gentle, necessary, cleansing. She didn't rush to respond. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it into her journal, and went for a walk. The air was brisk, the wind chimes behind her singing like they knew something she didn't yet. By the time she reached the post office that afternoon, she'd already written her reply. Julia, I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in effort. If you want to know me, start where you stopped. Write me a letter once a week. No texts, no calls, no audience. Just you, using your own voice again. Love, Mom. She sealed it with a single piece of tape, no flourish, mailed it. Then went home and made soup. Lentil, the way Walter used to like it. Heavy on the time. The next letter came 6 days later. It was shorter, tentative. Julia wrote about work, about the weather, about how quiet the house had become without Sadie's humming or Brian's constant complaining. Then a third letter, a fourth. They weren't remarkable, they didn't solve anything, but they were real. Mildred began to look forward to the soft thud of the mail slot each week. Sometimes Julia sent recipes she'd rediscovered. The lasagna Mildred made every Christmas Eve. The chocolate cookies she swore she'd hated but now admitted she missed. Sometimes Mildred replied with her own, not to correct, just to share. Between the recipes, the words began to widen, memories slipping through the cracks. Julia wrote about the time Mildred taught her to ride a bike, how she'd pretended not to cry when she fell. Mildred wrote back about that same day, confessing that she'd cried twice as hard once Julia went inside. Each letter loosened something that had stayed wound too tight for too long. Sadie started coming by every Friday after school. She'd drop her backpack by the door, help herself to whatever was cooling on the counter, and sprawl on the living room rug, while Mildred read aloud from whatever book she'd pulled from the library that week. Sometimes Irene joined them, knitting badly and offering unsolicited commentary on the plot. It was messy and warm and ordinary. One afternoon, Sadie came in holding the latest envelope. Another one from Mom, she said, placing it on the table. She's really doing it, huh? She is, Mildred said, pulling a pound cake from the oven. The scent of vanilla filled the small kitchen, the same smell that used to linger for days when Julia was a little girl standing on a stool beside her, holding a spoon too big for her hand. Mildred sliced a piece for Sadie, who grinned. You made the cake. It felt like time, Mildred said simply. They ate it warm, the sugar crisped just slightly on the edges. Irene, leaning against the counter with her coffee, smiled. You know, this is how you break a pattern, not a person. Mildred looked at her, a small smile ghosting across her lips. Breaking people never worked anyway. The wind chimes outside answered with a faint shimmer. That night, as she washed the last dish, Mildred looked at the small stack of letters on her counter, Julia's newest resting on top, sealed but not yet opened. She didn't rush. She let the sound of the wind through the porch fill the room first. Let it mingle with the faint hum of Billie Holiday drifting through her speaker. She dried her hands, sat, and slit the envelope. Julia's words were simple this time. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to tell you, Sadie's drawing of you and her is on the fridge now. Brian doesn't know I put it there. It feels like light in the dark. Love, Julia. Mildred smiled softly. Then she glanced toward her own wall, where the same drawing hung in its wooden frame. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the distance, just the quiet rhythm of something finally beginning to mend. And then, a knock at the door. A courier, envelope in hand. Clark's name on the corner. The envelope from Clark had contained only one sentence, handwritten across a crisp sheet of legal letterhead. It's official. The trust is fully funded and untouchable. No fluff, no explanation, just closure, printed in permanent ink. Mildred folded it carefully and filed it under After, the folder now fat with choices that no one else got to override. It was done. Julia didn't say the words, I left him. She didn't need to. The U-Haul spoke for her. So did the hollow sound of 2 bookshelves being dragged across Mildred's front porch, and the way Julia stood beside Sadie that afternoon. Not smaller, not fragile, just quieter. They were staying at a small 2-bedroom rental 10 minutes away. The furniture was spare, the lease short-term, the walls still empty. But when Julia handed her a set of Allen wrenches and said, "Let's do the bookshelves first," Mildred didn't hesitate. She held the frame steady while Julia drilled. Sadie unpacked boxes in the background, pulling out fantasy novels and battered paperbacks. She hummed under her breath like the house had always known her voice. It wasn't loud, but it was real. By the time they'd finished, the sun was low in the sky. The three of them stood in the center of the room, the last screws tightened. The shelves standing straight and stubborn. Mildred reached out and dusted the top edge with her sleeve. "Good bones," she said. Julia looked up. "The shelves or the house?" Mildred shrugged. "Both." They had dinner together that night. Nothing elaborate. Just rotisserie chicken, salad, and the sourdough rolls Julia used to burn, but now baked to perfection. No speeches, no tiptoeing. Just three people chewing and passing things and eating in the kind of silence that didn't feel like walking on glass. Just breathing in sync. Sadie sat cross-legged on the floor, plate on her lap, talking about her art teacher and how she'd been sketching the front porch for a project called Places That Feel Like People. Mildred raised her glass of iced tea. "You're going to make that teacher cry." Sadie grinned. "That's kind of the goal." Julia watched her daughter, her fork resting against the side of her plate, and said softly, "She's becoming herself again." Mildred nodded, then reached out and tucked a stray hair behind Sadie's ear. "No," she corrected. "She's just not hiding anymore." That night, back in her cottage, Mildred sat at her desk, the window cracked open, the wind chimes speaking in short silver notes. She lit a candle and opened her journal, the one now half full with new memories and clean boundaries. She wrote slowly, carefully. "This is the closeness I choose. Not the one they claimed. Not the one they guilted me into. But the one we're building, word by word, shelf by shelf, meal by meal." She smiled as she dotted the last period, then slipped the journal back in the drawer. Next to it sat a thin white envelope already addressed and sealed. A final check made out in Brian's name. Not to him, not even close. To Here for Good, a non-profit providing noise-canceling headphones to shelters, schools, and veterans centers. Memo. In honor of those who mistake silence for defeat. She almost laughed when she signed it. But the truth was, she didn't feel spiteful, just done. A few days later, she dropped off a new wind chime for Julia's porch. Smaller than hers, silver and wood, soft-toned and tuned to C major. Sadie hung it herself while Julia stood at the window, arms crossed, watching her daughter move like the future had already arrived. Mildred watched too, hands in her pockets. When Sadie stepped back and the wind caught the first gentle note, Julia turned. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. Mildred didn't smile. She just nodded once. "You don't have to be," she said. "You just have to stay open." They stood there for a long time, not hugging, not confessing, just standing. The way people do when the wreckage is behind them, but the dust hasn't fully settled. Sadie, sitting on the porch steps, looked up at them both. "You two look weird when you're peaceful," she said. Julia laughed. So did Mildred. It was the first time they'd laughed at the same moment in over a year. That night, Mildred sat by her window, tea in hand, wind chimes murmuring in the breeze. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't play a record, just listened to the air around her fill with small sounds. Bird calls, passing cars, faraway porch conversations. No echoes of Brian, no echo of who she used to be in his shadow. Her phone buzzed once on the table. A new message, from Sadie, photo attached. It was a picture of the bookshelf, fully stocked. On the middle shelf, between Anne of Green Gables and Where the Red Fern Grows, sat Julia's newest letter. The caption read, "We're leaving space for the rest." Mildred placed the phone face up this time and let it glow. The envelope had Sadie's handwriting, looped and deliberate, the kind she used when something mattered. Mildred opened it standing by the kitchen counter, still in her robe, the smell of toast lingering behind her like a memory. She unfolded the page with care, already smiling. "Grandma, I don't know how to say thank you right, so I'll just try it like this. Thank you for showing me how to leave without screaming. Thank you for showing me how not to vanish after. You did it all with grace, and I'm learning how to, too. We don't talk about quiet bravery enough. Love you bigger than the moon." Sadie Mildred reread it once aloud. Her voice didn't shake. Then she folded the letter, placed it gently inside her journal, and wrote underneath the last entry. Legacy secured. Later that morning, she stopped by the local bookstore, just to browse. No plans, no list. She moved slowly through the aisles like she belonged in every one of them. Literary fiction, cookbooks, travel. At the end of a row, she picked up a hardcover cookbook filled with recipes from old Southern kitchens, the kind her own mother used to make with bare hands and no apologies. She turned to the page for cornbread and smiled, reached into her purse and pulled out a folded note, ink still fresh. To whoever finds this, you deserve better than scraps. In food, in love, in life. Don't ask for permission to eat fully, live loudly, or leave gracefully. She tucked it between the pages, closed the book, and slid it back on the shelf. She didn't look around to see who was watching. Back home, she cooked herself breakfast, the kind she used to make for everyone else, but never quite took time to enjoy herself. 2 eggs, perfectly soft, a slice of avocado with red pepper flakes. Buttery toast. Black coffee in the mug Walter had given her for their 25th anniversary. For Mildred, still steeping, printed across the front. She sat at the table by the window and ate slow. No phone, no conversation, no one else's voice filling the room. Just the sound of her own fork on her own plate, and the birds outside marking a world still turning. When she finished, she rinsed her dishes, put on her favorite Sunday dress, pale blue with small white buttons, the one Julia used to call too fancy for errands, and let her hair down for no one but herself. Then she opened the windows and waited. Irene arrived just before noon, a bag of fresh muffins in one hand and a brand new novel in the other. No heavy themes, she announced, waving the book like a victory flag. Just coastal gossip and bad men getting what they deserve. My favorite genre, Mildred said, stepping aside to let her in. They settled into the sunroom, a place that had once been stacked with boxes and now bloomed with plants and paperbacks. The tea was already steeping. The lemon muffins were warm. You seem taller today, Irene said, peering over her glasses. I took up my space, Mildred replied. I'm not giving it back. They toasted with teacups, and then they read, side by side, surrounded by light. That evening the chimes sang with the breeze. The cottage glowed soft gold. And Mildred sat once again at her desk, journal open, pen in hand. She thought of every woman she'd watched shrink in rooms that didn't deserve her. Of every silence that had been mistaken for surrender. Of Sadie's voice, Julia's letters, her own. She turned to the first page of a brand new journal and wrote the opening line slowly, carefully. When my daughter's husband said, she should be grateful we keep her close, I nodded. I moved farther the next day and took my money with me. She closed the journal, set her pen down, and let the wind carry the rest.